Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of A Couple of Nukes. As always, I'm your host, Mr. Whiskey. And for those of you who have not heard recent episodes or you're new to this one, I am on the road traveling. I'm not in my normal studio setup, so I apologize if the audio or visual quality is impacted in any way. But even while traveling, I want to make sure these conversations happen because they are super important, especially today's. We're going to be talking about sleep health, which is vital. In fact, it's one of the most neglected things, I'll say in the world, but especially in America, and there's a lot of reasons for that, which we'll get into, social media, technology, hustle culture, there's so much that goes into it. And then, of course, a lot of times we've had episodes on the show addressing sleep because of my personal relation to being someone who worked on rotating shift work in the United States military. We've had a lot of first responders talk about it and blue collar workers as well. So, whether it's pulling all-nighters for college one time becomes a routine, or whether it was rotating shift work that you're having trouble breaking out of, or if it's just mental health impacting your sleep or physical health. We're going to get into that today with Dr. Benjamin Long. Great to have you here to talk about, again, such a crucial conversation, and I'm excited to get into it. But first, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on. I've been looking forward to this conversation. My name, like you said, Dr. Benjamin Long. I am a sleep medicine physician. Also, a similar connection. I spent most of my career up until this point in the United States Air Force as a sleep medicine doctor in the military. But right now, I'm participating in a program called the Career Intermission Program, where you essentially can take a break from active duty service for a few years. And one of those reasons was because I wrote a
Hmm.
book and wanted to be able to not sacrifice my time at the my full-time job in order to
Right.
promote the book. So that is a little about me. I am in San Antonio, Texas. I have my wife. We've been married with each other for about 12 years, 13 years. I'm about to get myself in trouble. And then my
Right.
son, he is 10 years old, and then our dog Rolo. And yeah, I for a long time thought I would just be a general pediatrician. That's my primary training is focusing on kids. But then kind of later into my training, I discovered sleep medicine, fell in love with it, and haven't really looked back since.
Always say the longer date because then you can just say, man, it's only been that long. I could have sworn,
Yeah.
it just feels like I've known you forever and I've loved you
Yeah.
so long. You can kind of backpedal. But if
Right,
you say
right.
less time, they're going to say, you think we've only been together that long? Like, what am I to
Yeah.
you, right? So always get the
Right.
longer one, right? That's
Yeah.
that's our first piece of advice from this episode. But yeah, so you were in the Air Force. Now, how did that work? Why did you join and what got you into that branch?
Yeah, I tell people I kind of just smushed my grandfather and my dad's careers together, and like that's what I wanted to do. My dad was a pilot in the Air Force. He
Mm.
actually started Army and then flew Huey helicopters, medevac, and then got out of the military. And then in the early 2000s, when they were needing pilots again, they recruited him to come over to the Air Force. He had been in the Air Force prior to that, but that was, I think, a lot before I was born. But, anyways, he was pilot in the military. And for a portion of my life, I spent moving to different bases. And then my grandfather was a pediatrician. So I kind of just felt like medicine and then military, and that was just like the natural path. And then for people who are interested in pursuing medicine, the military has what's called the Health Professions Scholarship Program, where they will pay for your medical school in exchange for military service. And so, since at the time I was anticipating going into a lower paying specialty, I didn't want to have this mountain of medical school debt to have to overcome. So that was a big reason for me was to not only serve, but also just financially as well. And so as I continued on that trajectory too, I just, have had the privilege of knowing a lot of military families and walking with them as their kids are getting older in the general pediatrics clinic. And frequently, at military families, you are separated from your support system geographically and demanding schedules. Really, no matter what your AFSC is in the military, you're going to have some kind of demands. And when they've done research on sleep deprivation, if you just compare same person, but in the military versus out of the military, in
Right.
the military is always more sleep deprived. And so then a big piece of the puzzle for me as a pediatric sleep doctor, that's my niche. I do all ages for sleep, but my niche that I feel is pediatric sleep. It makes sense that if a kid is not sleeping, then that service member who's a parent is not sleeping, and then it's going to be a lot harder for them to do their mission. And so my job is to come support the whole family and let's see if we can get the kid to sleep better so the service member can sleep better. So that way we can accomplish the mission better.
So when you say, pediatric sleep medicine, what age range is that specifically?
Yeah, most often it could be all the way down to birth. Most of the time I'm talking to families closer to the 4 to 6 month old mark because that's usually the
Okay.
earliest that you could start doing sleep training for most people. And
Right.
that's kind of the first conversations I'm having. And then all the way really up to somewhere in that 18 to 21-year-old range would probably classify as pediatric sleep. As you're getting into adolescence and, even once you're like 15, 16, there's not necessarily something super magical that happens at 18. So a lot of my adolescents have a lot of similar kind of barriers to good sleep. And so it can be anything from looking at their circadian rhythm, because sometimes that's a little bit later, and some teenagers are more naturally night owls and trying to work out how that's going to work with them for their school schedule and the demands that they have for them versus insomnia, whether that is I'm doing too many energy drinks or I have all this
Right.
homework or I have all this like, I'm just using my screens up until bedtime. So definitely as kids get older and different ages, then there are these unique barriers that as a pediatric sleep doctor, that's my expertise.
So you're not just intervention, but prevention with setting up, those young ones for healthy sleep that they will hopefully take into, their childhood as they continue to develop and grow. And then, you mentioned energy drinks is especially huge among the military audience and college as well. We've seen a shift in, what was primarily coffee dominated to now energy drinks and coffee or one or the other. And I've
Yeah.
talked before about the very unhealthy and toxic culture of a lot of, especially I feel like military males specifically have this like who can drink more energy drinks. And I've seen it in high schoolers too, just like, oh, it became almost like bragging rights if whoever slept the least was the most
Yeah.
successful. Like we've equated not sleeping to success because the idea is that if you're not sleeping, you are performing more. However, the quality of that performance is where the success should be measured, not the quantity, because you could be not sleeping and performing poorly, and that's
Hmm.
still more than other people. So I think that's a huge misconception. But, with this, for lack of better words, hustle culture that we have, which is, do more, more, and more on one side. On the other side, you mentioned, the doom scrolling and the bed rot, which is
Hmm.
sleep deprivation with really no success, in my personal opinion, right? It's just
Yeah.
a waste of productive time. I mean, what I want to kind of unpack that more, like the biggest challenges you're seeing in adolescence, especially that we as parents or mentors or family members can look out for and try to address, and what is the proper way to address it.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic question. I'll say one that I've done, gosh, maybe 15 other interviews in the past month or so, and no one's asked me that. So kudos on
Thank
that.
you.
But I will say one of the biggest things in teens definitely is that screen use, social media. That is a really huge cultural phenomenon that's going on. If you're looking at the research of instances of pediatric sexually transmitted diseases, that's going down. Instances of smoking or vaping is going down. Incidents of alcohol use is going down. And some people have tried to point at that and say, like, wow, look at like how amazing this is. And really the flip side of that is that teenagers are not in third spaces or in physical spaces because so much of their life is online right
Mm,
now. And so it's more common for if I'm talking to a teenager, one assessment that we'll do is called a heads assessment. We ask how are things at home, at school, activities, do you do any
right.
drugs, sleep and sex and suicidality, things of that nature. And so what we're noticing more is like teenagers are engaging in these high risk behaviors a lot less, but it's also due to the fact that they are just not going out. I actually just heard a recent survey study that talked about polling seniors in high school, asking them if they have even just dated. And back in like the I think it was the 90s, it was like 83% had said that they had dated at some point in their teenage life. And that has like shifted down to 60%. So a big jump in that these personal relationships that were very normal in adolescent culture has had a significant shift in them. And that's going to impact even to your sleep as well. Because if you are online so much, especially if you have schoolwork, extracurricular activities, or all these other things, then it's just the evening when you have time to either veg out or to connect with, if you play video games and connect with your friends online or play something online. And so I think it's a understanding that like social dynamic that's happening, I think is a big thing because that is also just going to not only impact your sleep, but overall just like mental health, well-being, and things of that nature. So getting back to like sleep specifically, I think a very common one that I hinted at was being more of a night owl. In adolescence, there is a natural shift in your circadian rhythm that is going to be later in the night that we think happens sometimes kind of around puberty.
Hmm.
And so, because of that, child who's normally sleeping maybe at like 9 o'clock, all of a sudden can't go to bed until midnight. And oftentimes in the past, that has been labeled as insomnia. And really, what it is that it's a misalignment between when their body wants to sleep and then socially when they need to fall asleep to wake up for school.
Right.
And so, my job as a sleep doctor is how to kind of tease that out a little bit because if you get labeled with insomnia, but it's your circadian rhythm that's the problem, then those are two
Mm.
different kind of treatments that we are going down. So there are some unique instances of sleep issues in adolescence, and that doesn't even bring up the whole school start time. And there's more of an advocacy within the American Academy of Sleep Medicine to have a later school start time because of that delay that we know happens. It happens naturally in most teenagers, that it's a slight shift. It might be more from like 9 to 10 p.m. kind of a thing, but we know that there is a portion of it that it's even later, and that's when we start
Mm.
talking about it as a disorder, quote unquote.
So do we yet understand the cause behind why this shift happens on the science and genetic side of it? What would cause this or why it's happening?
Yeah, there's some, evolutionary biology thoughts process behind it that as you are going through puberty and you're going to be more in a hunter-gatherer society, it would make sense if our biology was such that there was a certain, portion of the younger population that could stay awake later in order to protect us as a tribe or as a
Mm.
group. I think that is the like sociological or anthropological explanation for why that might be the case.
Okay.
And some of it also has to do with the amount of sleep pressure that builds. That seems to also slightly change as well. And so the regulation of your sleep is, we think about it in two processes. You have sleep pressure, which you can think about from the minute you wake up, that just builds and builds and builds at a slope kind of going up until you fall asleep, and that kind of comes down. I rough estimate talk about that as like adenosine that builds up in your brain. So if you go back to your high school biology class, you might remember ATP is the thing that our cells use to make energy. And as the body is doing its kind of chemical reactions, that ATP gets broken down to adenosine and then adenosine diphosphate. So you can roughly think of that buildup of adenosine is you're getting more and more and more kind of stress in the cell. And then eventually that your brain or all of your cells have to do something with that adenosine that has built up. And that is what is happening during sleep. And then when we're talking about caffeine, the reason why caffeine works is it actually blocks your adenosine receptor. So a misnomer for caffeine is often people think that it should make you more awake, but actually it doesn't stimulate you in that same kind of sense, and that it's actually just blocking your sleepiness perception essentially, which is why once that
Right.
caffeine is done and out of your body, then if you haven't slept or you haven't done anything to kind of help with your sleepiness, then it's coming back with a vengeance.
Right, for sure. And then one thing I also want to clarify for people listening is you talked about, the initial assessment is really what's going on at home, at school, and mental health wise. If someone is struggling with mental health, especially with suicidal ideation, are you qualified to discuss that with them, or do you have to refer them to a third party?
Yeah, I would say all physicians nowadays, at some level, we suicidality can happen with anybody. So I think most of us are comfortable with at least having an initial kind of conversation to see, okay, what's happening here? Or maybe I should say, my background training as a general pediatrician, we have a lot of children who come, unfortunately, to our just general pediatrics clinic and are suicidal. And
Mhm.
so we have to triage that in some ways to see what this means because off another thing that has shifted in that I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but just my experience personally, I have had over the course of my even short career, younger children coming in who are reporting that they're feeling suicidal. And part of
100%.
the yeah, and part of the issue though is oftentimes what I have found is that there are some children who are saying these things, but then and yet they don't even know what it means to be suicidal.
Mm.
But they will say stuff like they are going to hurt themselves or kill themselves or something because they know that it gets some kind of reaction from their parents. But then once you start talking to them, then you're getting a totally different story. So there's some of that where us as pediatricians understanding developmental
Right.
stages of figuring out, okay, like what are you actually talking about here? But majority of the time, to make sure that that child is safe and to make sure that the family is stable and stuff, we usually will have a mental health counterpart, whether a psychiatrist, psychologist, counselor, or someone who comes in to be able to help create a safety plan or might even have to move them over to the ER. So that is something that I think as physicians, it's just anyone can walk into your office and mental health doesn't stop at the door. So you
Right.
have to be able to have a protocol to address that for sure.
I 100% agree. I've guested on several shows, and even on this show, I've shared about the statistics for children in suicide, which a lot of the companies that run these statistics consider childhood up to 25 for these
Hmm.
statistics, right? And you look
Yeah.
at the interesting shifts, which is from like as young as 10 years old, sometimes younger, but around 10 years old, which to me is truly sad that you have children who are suicidal. Like you said, you have to decipher through, what are they actually expressing? But for the ones that truly are, which we've seen, it's really
Hmm.
sad that it's gotten to the point with social media, with cyberbullying, with bad family dynamics that children are feeling that. And it's definitely also, for lack of better words, it's more accessible slash inspired in them because of their access to technology. They've seen these words more, right? As we have more mental health movements, suicide is a much more talked about topic. And I don't think
Hmm.
that inspires people, right? But it does put it in their mind. Like we know this word, we know what self-harm is and stuff. It like even when I was in high school, it was trending for young women to cut themselves, not for suicidal ideation or self-harm, but just for attention or like it's trending like, hey, are you the only one of our friend group who isn't gonna cut herself? Which is terrible social pressure and it's not the only online trend we've seen that was harmful to people that people participated. In fact, when I was going into the military, people were eating Tide Pods. I'm not sure
Hmm.
how many of y'all listening are familiar with that, but people were eating Tide Pods, all right? Sometimes people just spread and encourage terrible ideas, but I want to bring it back to say from age 10 to about 18, it was mainly young women and young girls who were self-harming and maybe attempting suicide but not completed. And then from 1825, the majority of those were men and they were completed suicides. So
Hmm.
seeing those statistics was interesting and it really gave insight into from 10 to 18, it was really young women and girls because of the way self-image is during that phase, the way high schoolers and college girls interact with one another, and then the family dynamic. And then from 1825 is when young boys become, men and off or on their own oftentimes, and they have to deal with all the pressures and responsibilities suddenly of being a man, which as a young boy, is not there as much. So to see these statistics, I think it is truly sad. But I like something you said, which is, mental health issues don't stop at the door, whether you're that type of doctor or not. And I think, it's so important for parents to be checking in on their children now more than ever about this kind of stuff. And it can be a very difficult conversation to have, but it's a necessary one. And then I want to address, all this doom scrolling and time before bed. what would you say? I know a lot of doctors and other, researchers have put out different times. Have you found is the best timeline for, a period of time away from your phone prior to bed? Is it 1 hour, 2 hours? Is there a magic number? Is it a really personal thing? Like, how does that work?
Absolutely. I would say there's probably not a single magic number that's going to be the absolute best for every single person. There's probably like a rough good 30 minutes to an hour is a reasonable amount of time, but it depends on like what are you engaging in, what are you seeing, how is it making you feel, and all of those different factors are going to impact how early you need to set down your cell phone. So if you are getting really anxious with your screen use, then probably a lot earlier you need to put that down and make sure that you are calming down and getting to a good point before you fall asleep compared to someone who is using their phone and maybe they aren't feeling quite as stressed, but they really want to be productive. And so they're just trying to do more things, but it's easier for them to calm down. Those are two totally different scenarios where I would say maybe this person might need closer to an hour or 2 hours, whereas this person might need closer to 30 minutes to an hour. So I do think it is individualized. And I think that's often what people think about when we're talking about insomnia is usually sleep hygiene. Unfortunately, the problem with sleep hygiene is it only fixes bad sleep hygiene. It doesn't actually address the root causes for
Right.
insomnia. And so most people are actually really surprised when I tell them I'm a sleep doctor, but all that stuff of like, what's the temperature of your bedroom, how much light exposure, your screen time use, all of those kind of things, I really don't even talk about them until closer to like maybe my third or fourth follow up. And so, really, as a sleep doctor, we want to get at to the root of those problems. And we know that there are certain maladaptive behaviors for insomnia that are going to perpetuate that we are trying to break in our therapy.
Mm. I can definitely agree with that. The root cause is much more important than those all those little factors. Of course, those contribute, and I think sleep hygiene has, generationally gotten worse because a lot of people like to work from their bed. They're on their laptop on their bed, their phone on their bed. And, that separation makes such a big difference because honestly, that was something that unfortunately, in the military barracks room I had, I just had, the bed and I had to set up a little desk because I
Mm-hmm.
was trying to work on my bed and I would just fall asleep. And then also when I would try to sleep, I felt like it was time to work. And so separating that changed a lot for me. But like you
For
mentioned,
sure.
that root cause is a huge thing. And I want to get into your book you mentioned earlier, working on your book, taking time off to focus solely on that and the promotion of that. And obviously it's something very beneficial to us, reflective of this conversation. So I'd love for you to share a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So when we're talking about insomnia, that's really what I'm trying to get at in my book called Sleep Habits Journals. The subtitle is Practices, Prayers, and Devotions to Ease Your Sleepless Nights. And so my particular interest and niche beyond just pediatric sleep medicine is I'm also really interested in the intersection of theology and spirituality with sleep medicine. And so I wanted to create a resource that brought those two worlds together to really help specifically Christians, really anyone who's open to a kind of Christian worldview or perspective could access, like could use the book with some success probably, but it came from walking alongside people who are experiencing sleeplessness who themselves said that they're Christian. I would they would tell me that they read their Bible, they pray and do things like that. But then when I asked how their religious identity impacts how they respond to their insomnia, then most people just kind of looked at me like, I don't know, like I'm not sure. I haven't really thought of that before. And yet what I found is that so often the supplemental things that we have in therapy for insomnia, like guided imagery, deep breathing, yoga, and meditation, and these other things that they're good to kind of help out when once you're getting to the root problem. But for people who are coming from a Christian worldview, then that may not be something that is appeasing to them or something that is easily incorporated into their lifestyle compared to utilizing the natural tools that their religion gives to them. And so some of it was from that to better serve my patients. But then the flip side too, I myself am a Christian from a Christian faith tradition. And so it also was my own journey of trying to figure out how do I kind of put these two parts of myself together in a way that is, being true to myself, but also in a way that is beneficial for my patients, isn't a hindrance to my patients or anything like that. And so the sleep habits journal is centered around what I call the sleepless night rules. For anyone who's ever done cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, they're going to sound really familiar because they're based off of what's called the stimulus control instructions. Exactly what you were just talking about. Very often, people will do work in their bed or other things in their bed, and you can condition yourself to associate your bed as a place where you're supposed to be awake. So, what you intuited, where you're like, I need to separate these spaces, and the bed needs to be for sleep, and then I can work in a chair or a desk or something on the other side of this room, is really important for us because if your bed is both a place that you sometimes eat, sometimes sleep, sometimes worry, sometimes work, then that can send a lot of different signals to your brain. So we try to simplify that. And the
Mm.
best way to do that is to make sure you're only using your bed for sleep. For people who are sexually active, we'll usually say sleep and sex as well. And so for the sleep habits journal, the 5 sleepless night rules are cease before bed and wait to feel sleepy. So, actually drawing a line in the sand if you're a super productive person. So that way you're actually committing to a bedtime. Many people will commit to, I need to wake up at this time, but that bedtime kind of waxes and wanes.
Mm.
So one step is
Yeah.
really just drawing that line in the sand, saying, this is when I'm going to transition to bed. And then also waiting until you feel sleepy to actually get into bed. If you're just like, I'm laying down because it is 8:30 and I lie down at 8:30, but I'm wide awake, you're not doing anything good for yourself. So if it's past your bedtime, but you're not feeling sleepy yet, sitting in a chair or doing something while you're waiting. And so oftentimes from a Christian worldview, I'm telling people you can engage in prayer, Bible reading, or do things to connect with God. Then you wait, feel sleepy, lie down. And then if you can't fall asleep, rise out of bed. That's a really difficult one for a lot of people too, because they're like, Doc, I'm trying to sleep. So why would I get out of bed if I'm trying to sleep? And it's that connection that you've created again. If you are tossing and turning, more tossing and turning is not going to make you fall asleep. We kind of trick our brains to think that because intermittently, eventually, you do fall asleep after tossing and turning. You might toss and turn 5 times on one night, 2 times on another night, 7 times on one night. But we kind of send a signal to ourselves that it's like, yeah, eventually I will fall asleep. But that intermittent reward isn't actually helping us in the long run. So getting out of
Right.
the bed, so that way the time that you spend in your bed is you're actually asleep. For adults, that efficiency should be roughly 85 to 95%. So if you're telling me it takes you, super long time to fall asleep, that's not healthy. On the flip side, some people are surprised sometimes when they're like, "Oh, doc, I like my head hits the pillow and I fall asleep within minutes." I'm like, you might actually also be like overexhausted or, like you're falling asleep too quickly as well too. So it is normal for it to take you at least like 10, 15 minutes for you to be able to fall asleep. So if you're south of that, that could be something to also talk about with a physician. But in the book, I'm primarily talking about insomnia. And so if you can't sleep, rise out of bed. And then the third rule is really just to connect with God and wait to feel sleepy again. And then that's really the core and the difference from what we typically talk about with stimulus control is just that worldview and what is my meaning, what is my purpose and the goals, and how do I, you know, the questions with worldviews is like, who am I? How did all this get here? Why are humans the way that we are? Like, there's so much kind of philosophical, theological questions in that we don't always think about that undergirds a lot of our science and worldview and the places that we are going. So, from the Christian worldview, connecting with God, and seeing the sleepless night as an invitation to connect is something different that you won't get necessarily in a typical sleep doctor instructions. And then the fourth rule is really just to repeat. So, going back to steps 2 and 3, if you're not able to fall asleep again when you lay back down, rise out of bed and then connect with God and wait to feel sleepy. And you keep doing that until you actually fall asleep. And then the last one is resist sleeping in and taking naps. And usually that's the point where I lose a lot of people because they're like, don't take away my naps. I need my naps to be able to fall asleep. And I tell people, I say resist for a reason because it's not that you have to destroy all of that, but it's about setting some guardrails and some boundaries,
Right.
because that's really the root problem of the insomnia. Is the things that perpetuate your insomnia are that sleeping in and taking long naps. Because when we're talking about that sleep pressure, those things help you and that you get more energy, but it actually steals away from your sleep pressure to fall asleep tonight or the next night. So in the long run, it's actually hurting you. And so there's that education component of that. And I think people realize that, but the problem with insomnia for so many people is our lives are so chaotic, full of so many stressors and so many things that it's hard for us to be able to implement these rules and put them into place. And so then that's the purpose of the book. It's centered around those 5 rules, and you can just jump in wherever. You could go in order, or you could go to the specific rule that you're having difficulty with. And I like to tell people it's the insomnia book for people who hate to read. Because instead of, you might have read those books where you read a whole chapter and then you have to get to the questions at the end. And especially if
Right.
you are like me and you put that down and then you come back like a month later and you're like, wait a second, what are we talking about here? And you've already forgotten all of the other steps and you feel like you have to start all over in order to kind of get back to where you once were. And then you're just like repeating yourself. The book is set up to be accessible in a way that each chapter is full of these bite-sized interactions and activities
Okay.
that are designed to kind of get you just one step down the road. So that way, if you do come back 6 months later, you remind yourself maybe of the rules, but then you could just jump back in wherever you're having difficulty.
Right. And you mentioned the subtitle was Practices, Prayers, and Devotions to Ease Your Sleepless Nights. So there are prayers and devotions in there. Are those a collection of prayers for sleeping, or are these original prayers that you wrote for guided sleeping prayers?
Yeah, so some of them, each section does have usually a prayer that I wrote, as far as like a prayer for ceasing, a prayer for rising from your bed, a prayer for when you're repeating and trying to, have to do that multiple times in a night. But then there's also space for you to kind of write your own prayers. There are some historic prayers. A very common one is the Jesus prayer. So, oftentimes in more recent periods of discussions of Christian spirituality, we connect that to your breath and doing a breath prayer, which is essentially a prayer that you can say within a single breath. And so, the
Mm.
historic Jesus prayer is, Lord Jesus, Son of God, have mercy on me. And then some traditions add a center, other traditions don't add that at the end. So there is some variability
Okay.
there. But it comes from a passage in Luke where a beggar named Bartimaeus is calling out to God and he's, saying, Lord Jesus, I think he says son of David in that chapter,
Yeah.
have mercy on me. And so it's that same kind of thing that you're in this place. Insomnia can be such an isolating experience for people. So really just crying out for mercy. And that really gets to, well, what does the Bible have to say about sleep, or why even do this? I think some people from, not a religious background might feel like I'm muddying the waters a little bit, like I'm trying to mix oil and water a little bit here.
Mm.
But really, all of us, whether we realize it or not, are operating out of some kind of theology. Theology seems like this weird, loosey-goosey term, but really it's just the study of God and how God has revealed himself and relates to his creation, is how we would probably talk about it within Christian theology. And so, if I'm operating out of an atheistic worldview where there is no God, and from, the only thing is matter that I can see and feel and touch and smell and hear and all of that kind of a thing, then that is going to lead me to ask certain questions, to make certain assumptions about reality, and will lead me down a path. Compared to if I believe that there is a God who has created the universe, who is sustaining it, who knows me, loves me, and cares about me, cares for my sleep, that's going to lead me down a totally different path. So,
Mm.
so when that argument of that I might be muddying the waters, I tell people, well, actually, I'm not adding anything new. I'm just bringing to the forefront what all of us are already holding within ourselves, is that we have certain beliefs around whether there is a God and how much God is involved or is not involved in creation or things of that nature. And that's going to impact the paths that we are taking. And so for the book, I'm trying to bring it back to how does the Bible talk about sleep and sleeplessness,
Right.
and how can we maybe like think about it differently?
100%. I think that's really important. And just interesting fact that a lot of people don't realize is it actually takes more faith to be an atheist if you look at all the scientific principles, and this is science and math, of the alignment of all these numbers that make up the universe, especially around Earth's sustainment of life. If they were
Hmm.
sometimes as much as 0.00001 different, there would be no life. It actually takes more faith to believe that everything aligned perfectly than to say someone manually did all this. Just a fun fact out there. But yeah, I like in your bio online when I was reading up about you, you describe sleep as a gift from God and something that he does want for us. And obviously the big example everyone goes to is even God rested. And God doesn't need a rest, right? So why would he do it? As an example. The same reason I
Hmm.
say Jesus Christ wept over the death of Lazarus, already knowing he was going to bring him back to life. So why did he cry? To show that death is a time of mourning, especially
Hmm.
for men. I talk about one of the things I teach is biblical masculinity, which is different from modern masculinity. And a lot of
Hmm.
toxic masculine people, the Bible is how I have to argue against them, right? Because we have the perfect man was already here and showed us how to be a good man, right? And it's very different from what people put out today, right? And especially in terms of humility and versus flashy masculinity and emotions, right? Jesus had emotions and he expressed them, both sorrow and anger,
Yeah.
and showed those. Jesus wept over, the night before he was going to be crucified, he wept, right? He was afraid. It's is not something to be ashamed of or say I'm not masculine because I have fear or because I have sorrow. But there was a time and place for it, right? He didn't do it all the time every day. So I think it's so important in both Jesus and God rested, and they showed us why, right? It wasn't for them, it was for us. I mean, God said, Sabbath was made for the man, not man for the Sabbath, right? So
Hmm.
I think it's so important. And on that note, what I love to end my episodes with whenever I have a faith-based individual is if you could share one Bible quote right now, what would that be? What is on your heart to share with everyone?
Yeah. Oh man, there's a lot of good ones, but one of my favorites that I keep coming back to with sleep is Psalm 127. And that starts off with, unless the Lord builds the house, the builder is laboring in vain. Unless the Lord
Mm,
watches over the city, the watchman is watching in vain. And then in verse 2, it is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest. And there's one translation I particularly love and describes it as eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. And that really is the key verse that I make that theological claim that sleep is a gift that comes, straight from that psalm, that thousands of years ago, before we were way busy and filled up our time with all this technology and had all of this stuff, a psalmist was saying, it is totally in vain my endeavors that I am trying to do, whether that is building a house, watching over a city, unless God is doing that. My participation in that, if I think I am completely in control, is a total illusion.
mm,
And so, really, how often do we even say that ourselves? I got to get up early because I have to do X, Y, or Z, or I can't go to sleep yet because I still have this to do. And the psalmist is talking exactly of that. Like, you are eating the bread of anxious toil. You're doing all of this work and all of this stuff when you're not even realizing the gift that God has given you in sleep.
mm,
And and that really flips the narrative of sleep on its head compared to how we think about sleep as something that I might need, but it's just this merely a biological reality. And versus the Bible is giving us this idea of sleep as a gift that we receive, and that does something to us because then sleep becomes this embodied trust that I can be transformed more and more into a person of trust. Not to say that the lack of sleep means that you don't trust God, because there's also a psalm or proverb that talks about an evil man can't fall asleep until he's done evil. So that seems, really weird and counterintuitive. But I think it's to show that tension there, and that this isn't magic, it's communication, not manipulation, that you're trying to connect with God. It's a relationship. And so we can think God cares about me, sleep is a gift, but moving that down into my heart, that takes time. And so that's what I'm
right.
trying to guide people through in the book, is truly believing that God cares for me and cares for my sleep.
I completely agree. And we're going to have your website and the book in the description below where people can also sign up to stay connected with you. But I think this has been a great conversation, very straightforward and impactful. And I think, when you change like you were saying, when you change your attitude towards sleep and you change how you use it, you really change your attitude toward yourself in the long run because how you respect your sleep is how you respect yourself and it's how you respect God. So I think that's a beautiful thing. And I appreciate what you're doing because, like you said, it's not something we find very often. And interestingly enough, a lot of believers who struggle with sleep don't go to God, for help with it. Not just insomnia, but people who suffer from extreme night terrors and other sleeping conditions. We don't think to bring that to God as well, but we're to bring everything to Him. So I
Mhm.
really appreciate what you're doing, helping be a catalyst for that. And thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This was great.